Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Loyan. Our show topic today, Siege at the Capitol and Homegrown Violent Extremism, Is It Here to Stay? Our guest is Dr. Michael Jensen. He is a senior researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. He also leads the Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States PIRUS project, which is a first-of-its-kind database on the characteristics of U.S. radical extremists. Let's welcome Dr. Michael Jensen. Welcome, Dr. Jensen.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you lead the Center's team on domestic radicalization, and you manage the data collection in the Global Terrorism database. And it's used by the U.S. Department of Justice and other intelligence agencies around the world. With regards to domestic terror analysis and predictable events, did you see a January 6th type of event, siege at the Capitol, on the horizon?
It's always difficult to predict those types of mass mobilization moments, but we had been warning for several months that the conditions appeared to be lining up that would allow for something like that. So we had a large number of individuals that were showing up at demonstrations and at rallies, that were participating in online extremist communities, that were talking about mobilizing and getting together. And shortly after the election results were certified or in favor of Joe Biden, they began talking about January 6th as a really important day, and a day in which they would all have to get together to make their voices heard. So we weren't surprised that this happened, saddened for sure, but there were plenty of warning signs.
And those warning signs, did they come from social media? And what exactly were those warning signs?
There were a number. Social media is certainly a big one. So we saw participation in online extremist groups skyrocketing in the months leading up to the election, and then certainly after the election. But in addition to that, we saw more real world activity taking place in the last several years that was really concerning. So we saw hate crime activity in the United States was increasing. The number of domestic extremist events tied to far-right groups like white supremacists and anti-government militias were starting to increase as well. And we had a presidential administration that was in many ways providing the fuel for these movements. It was supportive of these movements in many ways. And so the warning signs were not only what people were saying on social media, but it was behaviors that we were witnessing in the real world.
What struck me is that you saw the warning signs, but it appeared that the Capitol was so unprepared. Why was that?
That's a difficult question. From what I have heard, it sounds like they had a pretty much a top to bottom failure, and bureaucracy got in the way in many cases. So there were warnings ahead of the Capitol demonstration that a large number of people would be descending on Washington, and some of them were talking about engaging in violent activity. The intelligence wasn't perfect on that, though. So some of the intelligence that was being delivered to Capitol Police was suggesting that these would probably be pretty isolated events, and there was only a small possibility that something could happen. And so Capitol Police didn't respond perhaps as strongly as they should have to those warning signs. But the other thing is just that, this was a big bureaucratic machine in terms of moving people around and changing security plans. Takes a lot of individuals involved, and so calling up the National Guard or having more of a police presence was something that really took a lot of effort, and it was difficult to mobilize ahead of the event. And then once it started, they ran into the same challenges when they made calls for more National Guard to come to help quell the crowd and the violence. It took hours for those requests to make their way up the chain of command and actually result in some help.
Now, the FBI director, Christopher Wright, had warned us that white supremacist groups would be one of the biggest threats to our nation. Is that something you found in your research?
Yeah, and FBI Director Wray is not the first government official that has made that assessment. Actually, back in 2009, there was a report that came out of the Department of Homeland Security that warned that far-right extremist groups were starting to organize in much larger numbers, and they were posing a threat. The report suggested things that, like former law enforcement, former military were particularly susceptible to recruitment by these organizations. The report was met with a lot of criticism from Republican leadership. They really took offense to the report, and so much so that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security at the time, Janet Napolitano, actually apologized for the report and retracted it. But it was based on sound evidence. We saw these groups starting to form in more places, and individuals were beginning to mobilize, and we saw an increase in the events related to these groups. So we saw FBI hate crime statistic numbers start to creep up in the aftermath of the after Obama's election. Famously, we saw at Charlottesville in 2017 a mass demonstration of these organizations. But there was plenty of data to suggest that these individuals, these groups, these movements were growing.
Now, was it in the 1990s with the Timothy McVeigh bombing of the Oklahoma City federal building that recently the far-right white supremacist extremists regrouped?
Far-right white supremacist organizations have really been around since the beginning of this country, and they've, at 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had membership around 3 million individuals. So there's always been an element of far-right white supremacist extremism in the history of this country. The Ku Klux Klan had a membership of around 3 million in the 1920s. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, we did see a resurgence of white supremacy in this country around the white power movement. There was a music scene that developed, and individuals began to organize in these separate groups. And we also saw a movement towards anti-government extremists as well. So Timothy McVeigh famously was an anti-government extremist, responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. So the 1990s were a pivotal period where these groups became quite active. And there was a crackdown on them that occurred, especially after the Oklahoma City bombing, and we saw some waning in their influence. But we really saw an uptick again with the election of President Obama, and certainly over the last few years.
Now, where does your data come from? Is it something you mine on the internet? Where does it all come from?
Yeah, so we're first tipped off about a case usually when an arrest is made. So we'll get a news notification alert of some kind that an individual has been arrested and there's some suspicion of links to extremism or some extremist motivation behind the act. At that point, we'll begin to investigate the background of the individual using whatever public sources we can find. So news reports, court records, police reports, anything that's available in open sources. We'll begin to look into to try to investigate the background of the individual to verify that they were in fact affiliated with an extremist group or movement, or that their crime was motivated by some extremist goal. And then we begin to look more closely at their background characteristics. So everything from their basic demographic information, where they live, how old they are, whether they're married or have children, whether they ever served in the military, but then looking at things that likely played a more unique role in their radicalization process. So everything from early childhood experiences to their family dynamics, their education backgrounds, their work histories, looking at how they were exposed to extremist content, whether they were recruited into the movement by a family member or a friend, or they found it online. So we really try to understand everything that played a role in their radicalization trajectory.
From what I was reading, some of the data that you've published, it used to be back in the Timothy McVeigh day, it took 18 months to radicalize an individual, but today it's 7 months. I assume that is because of social media and the way that information can transfer between two individuals these days. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we believe, is that the main effect of much of extremism moving into the online world is that it speeds up the radicalization and the mobilization processes. If you were an individual that were involved in a white supremacist movement in the 1980s and the 1990s, the way you got involved was you knew someone that was involved in the movement. You had a cousin or a friend that got involved, and they recruited you in, and they exposed you to the ideology, and you went through the initiation to join a real world face-to-face organization. But all that really began to change later in the 1990s, and especially in the early part of the 2000s, as these groups started to exploit technology to spread their message. So individuals were able to come together online to share ideas, to radicalize each other, to mobilize each other. And what happens in an online environment is it tends to be hyper radicalizing and hyper mobilizing. These are environments that are active 24 hours a day that individuals immerse themselves in. And the way these social media platforms are set up is that they're set up to keep people online as long as possible and engaged on their platform as long as possible. So if you express even a little bit of interest in a topic, the platform is going to offer you more of that content. And so what happens is individuals kind of slip down the rabbit hole and they end up in these echo chambers where all they're hearing are these extremist ideas and hearing people encouraging them to do something on behalf of the beliefs. And it really has this effect of radicalizing individuals quite quickly.
And the algorithms give them basically the same type of propaganda that they're actually looking at, so that they don't get a chance to hear the other side of the coin, or what might be truth versus fact or fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
So it
Yeah,
kind of perpetuates itself. It
it,
self-perpetuates.
exactly. So, the algorithms are trained to keep you on the platform as long as possible. And the way that you will stay on the platform is if you're seeing what you like. And so once you expressed an interest in something, then you will get offered more of that content to keep you engaged. So if you express an interest in the QAnon conspiracy theory, you will get recommendations to view more content about QAnon and from QAnon followers, until you fall deeper and deeper into it, and you eventually don't hear any other viewpoints other than the extremist narrative that you kind of self-selected yourself into. The social media companies, I will say, have really worked hard over the last couple of years to try to improve that process. So they are refining their algorithms all the time to try to make sure that they're not amplifying the problem. The issue is that they're always playing catch up to some extent. These extremist groups are really adaptable. They're quite flexible. They know how to take advantage of the platforms. So by the time the companies catch on to the fact that they're exploiting their platform in some new way, they've already got thousands, if not tens of thousands, members involved in their communities. And so then it gets shut down and they switch their tactics again. And it's just this constant kind of game of whack-a-mole.
Mm-hmm. What I want to do is I want to delve into the psyche of some of these people, what motivates them. You have written about different narratives that, some people have the grievance narrative. Some people have what they call the far right narrative. Can you explain what the difference is between the two, if there is a difference?
Sure. Well, the one thing to understand about radicalization is that it's incredibly complex, and there really isn't a single profile of an individual who radicalizes or a single way in which people radicalize. People start at different places in their lives and end up at the same point of of engaging in extremism. So, for example, you have some individuals where you can identify a trigger moment in their lives where they became vulnerable to the narrative and to recruitment. This could be a traumatic experience in their life, the loss of a loved one, a parent or a sibling at a young age. It could be experiences with physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, and they're looking for solutions to those problems. They're looking for camaraderie because of that trauma that they've experienced, and they find it in a recruitment narrative from an extremist organization, and that starts their pathway in. Others have very explicit grievances. They feel like they've been wronged in some way. So, they feel like they haven't been able to meet all of their own expectations in terms of their careers and their families. And it's not because of their own decisions or their own behaviors. It's because there's a conspiracy against them.
That's
And
what they
what's really
believe.
dangerous, that's what they believe, right? That there's these individuals that have unified and are working to thwart their attempts to achieve their goals. What becomes really dangerous in the radicalization process is when an individual begins to tie their own personal grievances to perceived grievances of a community that they feel they belong to. So it's not just that I am being victimized here, it's that I'm a part of this broader community. We're collectively being held back. And it's my responsibility to fight on behalf of my community to improve our situation.
Isn't that a way, though, of not taking self-responsibility? Is it?
It tends to be a natural human tendency that when things aren't working out for you the way you want them to, you look to place blame elsewhere. So most people aren't very good at critical introspection, where they question their own decision making and their own behaviors. It's much more appealing psychologically to believe that it's not your fault. that there was really nothing you could do about it because you were the victim of some larger conspiracy against you.
And that's where this whole narrative plays in about the election fraud, someone being gypped, someone being, you know, treated poorly. And that was the paradigm that former President Trump had elicited, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, the former administration was quite good at tying a number of grievances together with the same kind of common enemy group. So whether it was grievances over liberal immigration policies or healthcare policy or public safety measures, it was always that there's this group of liberals that are working to undermine the traditional American way of life, and especially the way of life for white male Americans. So white nationalist organizations, alt-right groups took this narrative and ran with it. And so in their view, white men have been absolutely fundamental to the development of the modern world. They should be praised and celebrated for that. But there's this conspiracy against them. There's these kind of politically correct warriors and liberal elites that have banded together to try to thwart their attempts to maintain status within their communities and maintain importance. And so they're unifying behind this collective identity of victimization, that we are all being victimized and that we all need to work together to reverse that.
Historically, has this type of victimization really taken place prior to this escalation we're seeing now?
Certainly, there have been community groups in this country and elsewhere that have been victimized. They're just not the ones right now that are claiming victimization. So if you look at minority and disadvantaged communities in this country, absolutely, they've been collectively victimized. And civil rights movement was a response to that type of collective victimization. What we're seeing right now with the political justice movement and the criminal justice movement in this country is another reflection of real world collective victimization. The problem is that in these individuals' eyes, they're not all that interested in what you and I might consider facts or evidence. They have their own facts and their own evidence, and they feel like they've been just as victimized as everyone else.
Now, this QAnon movement, do you know where did that come from, or you know how or why did it appeal to certain of these individuals?
Yeah. So QAnon developed out of a precursor conspiracy theory called Pizzagate. And the argument that individuals were making was that there was a group of liberal politicians that were protected by the deep state and were linked up with Hollywood celebrities that were involved in a child sex trafficking ring. And it was a very bizarre conspiracy theory. They believed that the sex trafficking ring was being run out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. It actually inspired an individual to show up at the pizza parlor and open fire inside of it. QAnon took that narrative and developed it further. So a post occurred on 4chan board in 2017 under a thread called the calm before the storm, which was a reference to something that Donald Trump had said in a photo op. And an individual posted saying that they were a high-ranking intelligence official that had inside knowledge of this deep state cabal of child sex traffickers and knew firsthand that Donald Trump was handpicked to fight this illegal enterprise. And that the military was working with him to help undermine that, and that we would soon see what they called the storm, which was going to be the mass arrest of Democrats and other liberals who were involved in this criminal enterprise. It remained a fringe conspiracy theory on 4chan in smaller platforms like that for a while, but what we've really seen over the last year is that it's taken off in this country. And what happened was it moved on to more mainstream platforms, and the platforms weren't ready for it. They weren't looking out for it. They really didn't have any policies in place to moderate the content. So they moved on to Facebook, and before you knew it, there was somewhere around 9,000 Facebook groups dedicated to QAnon that had 3 million members. Twitter had hundreds of thousands of QAnon accounts. YouTube had QAnon influencers posting videos, and they had hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And so it really ballooned quite quickly. And it was aided and embedded by the pandemic and the fact that so many people were isolated and at home, spending a lot of time online, and they were finding this conspiracy theory quite easily on these mainstream platforms.
The fact that they were, was it the fact that they were on mainstream platforms actually lend itself to their legitimacy?
Perhaps some people viewed it that way, but what I think is the main effect is that it was just able to reach hundreds of millions of people within one click, right? So it was just a click away. These smaller platforms like 4chan's and at the time 8chan, now 8kun, and the ones that are currently running like Telegram and Parler, they have hundreds of thousands and millions of members, but Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have hundreds of millions of users around the world. And so it's a huge audience you can tap into. And the other thing that was helping the conspiracy theory was that the administration at the time was not trying to separate themselves at all from the conspiracy. So they weren't denouncing it. In some ways, they were promoting it. So Donald Trump famously retweeted QAnon posts over 200 times during his presidency. When he was asked what he thought about QAnon, he basically said that he thought they were fine people that clearly loved him a lot. And so, there was no public denunciation from the top, from the conspiracy theory, and that gave it some validity for some individuals, that it appeared like the president, who is the hero of this story, was giving some legitimacy to the narrative. And so I think that helped people latch onto it.
What I find perplexing is that their claims are so outrageous. I mean, verifiably outrageous. When that person stormed that pizza parlor to find the basement, he found there was no basement, there was no children. When are they going to learn?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of them have. I think that the election was the final straw for some individuals. We've seen some individuals very publicly come out and talk about how they are leaving the movement because its predictions have failed one after the other. Others are really deeply committed to the idea. And so every time one of these predictions fails, whether it's child sex trafficking or the election, really anything, that they've predicted, they reinvent the narrative to explain away why something didn't happen. But for the diehards, they really enjoy this community, and they get a lot of self-fulfillment out of this community. And so they will look for ways to reinvent the narrative to explain away that failed prediction. So I definitely think that since the election, especially since January 6th, that movement has struggled a little bit. I think people have questioned it more. People have walked away. It's also harder for QAnon followers to have a voice. The big platforms have really cracked down on their presence. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube have shut down millions of accounts related to QAnon. And so now they don't have as widespread of a reach. But there are some individuals that are just deeply dedicated to this conspiracy theory, and are going to stick with it. And some of them are fairly powerful individuals that have money. So there's now a QAnon political action committee that's going to put money behind political campaigns and things of that nature. So I think it's a movement that's struggling right now, but is not going anywhere.
Are other nations struggling with some of these same issues that you see, this internal strife on this type of crazy, like the QAnon basis? Are they going through some of similar?
Yeah, a number of countries have similarly seen an increase in QAnon-related activities. So you've seen individuals demonstrating in the United Kingdom and in Japan and in Australia on behalf of QAnon. It's not clear that it has reached as far into those populations as it has the United States, but it has now become a global conspiracy theory with dozens of countries having parts of their population that are now following the movement.
That's frightening. That is frightening.
It is frightening, and I think the hard question is, what do you do about it, right? How do you reverse that trend? And that's one that I don't think we have a good answer for at this point. Usually you would talk about a public education campaign that, you would present facts and evidence to dispel these myths, and you would roll that out, and it would be a counter-narrative program. But these are individuals that are deeply distrustful of science, of the news media, of politicians. And they aren't likely to listen to facts and evidence that are disconfirming of their theories. So what do you say to these individuals when they don't trust the voices that are supposed to be trusted? And so I don't know that we have a great answer right now for how to engage in this kind of mass de-radicalization of individuals that have latched onto this conspiracy. And we know families are struggling as well to get people back. So an alternative answer might be, well, let's support families that are trying to get their loved ones out of this movement, but we know that they too don't know how to do that, that they have family members that they describe as being so far gone, they don't even recognize them anymore, and they don't know what to do. So that's, to me, that's the really scary part about it, is not how far it's expanded and how far its reach has gone, is that we don't have a plan at all for how to reverse the tide.
It seems that they're taking a playbook from cult leaders, cult leaders who used to indoctrinate. There's been several famous ones, especially, the Jim Jones one. They're literally, they drank the Kool-Aid. These people are consuming all this misinformation, disinformation, and fantasy. Um, do you think it's more of a mental health issue? Do you think people are, because of this pandemic, they're just looking for more escape from reality? What do you think? I mean, are these people, are they, what's their backgrounds? Most of them, from your data, what do you see?
Yeah, so we've collected data on all QAnon inspired individuals in the United States that have been arrested for committing crimes on behalf of the conspiracy theory. And what we have found is some alarmingly high rates of things like mental health conditions and previous trauma. So we found that about 45% of the population of offenders had some diagnosable mental health condition that existed prior to their involvement in QAnon. So this wasn't just simply the case that they believe in QAnon, so they must have a mental health problem. No, these were individuals that family members and loved ones knew were struggling before they were exposed to QAnon beliefs. So everything from bipolar disorder to paranoid schizophrenia to individuals that had post-traumatic stress from military service. So, about 45%, that's a really, really high percentage in comparison to national averages of mental health problems. We also saw really high percentages of previous trauma, so experiences that happened before their radicalization that seemed to be triggering for some individuals. So, for example, there were, in our data, there were 6 women who were arrested for committing QAnon-inspired crimes prior to the Capitol insurrection, and 5 of those women were radicalized after experiencing trauma related to the physical or sexual abuse of their own children by family members or loved ones. And so they seem to have been drawn to the QAnon conspiracy theory out of the narrative that's pushed by the conspiracy theory that the followers are playing this really pivotal role in fighting the exploitation of children and child sex trafficking. It was something that was deeply personal to them because of their own experiences with their children. And so the message really resonated with them. So, mental health trauma, definitely we're seeing it in the backgrounds of these individuals. Others, we saw, about a third of the population of offenders had previous criminal histories prior to radicalizing. So these are individuals that were committing both violent and nonviolent crimes before they found QAnon, and they continue to do so after they found QAnon. So the backgrounds did vary to some extent, but there were some troubling characteristics.
Now, what about the quote unquote white nationalists, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers? What do they have invested in this? They're actually, I think, aligning with some of these QAnon conspiracies because they were all at the Capitol.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've seen unification on the far right over the last several years. It's mostly been a form of rhetorical collaboration where they're speaking with each other online. They're adopting the language of each other's groups and some of the symbols of the groups, and then they show up at demonstrations and they're there together. So January 6th was an instance where we saw all of these groups showing up, and they were all represented during the demonstration. But the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was another instance of these various groups coming together in the form of a public demonstration. We have not yet seen so much cross-movement collaboration in terms of specific plots or criminal activities in the United States, but that would be a really dangerous development if the Proud Boys start to work with the Oath Keepers or with QAnon people to plot attacks in the United States. We haven't seen any evidence of that at that point, but that would be a really concerning turn.
But they are collaborating with some of these events like at the Capitol and such as
Yeah.
that
So
and others.
yeah, we saw in the lead up to the Capitol, again, another reason why no one should have been surprised, especially law enforcement intelligence, that it was coming, is that they were very openly talking about mobilizing and collaborating together on January 6th. They were
So it was
talking
an
about,
open secret.
it was an
Pretty
open
much.
secret. I mean, they were on Twitter talking about which hotels to rent, or how, what were the best ways to get to DC. Should they bring weapons? Should they not bring weapons? Where's everybody meeting up on the morning? What's the plan? They weren't trying to hide this at all. They were communicating in open dialogue on major platforms talking about January 6th.
Now, we know how dangerous this is from historical perspectives. We saw that what happened in Oklahoma City. Where is this going to go? I mean, can we ever get back once the pandemic? I'm hoping once the pandemic is open, things will change. But is this our new normal, or are we going to ever get back to what we used to consider normal?
Yeah, so I don't think it is a new normal. I look at January 6th as a bit of an outlier event. There was really a perfect storm of conditions that had come together to allow for that event. We had political leadership that was mobilizing individuals to collaborate and to descend on Washington, D.C. on a given day and to show force. We had individuals that had exploited technology and social media platforms to collaborate in that moment. And we had individuals that were just really vulnerable to these narratives because of the pandemic and because of an election that was really divisive and polarizing in this country. And those conditions have now faded to some extent, right? So the tech companies have really cracked down on these groups and in these movements. They're finding it harder and harder to organize on those platforms, and they're moving to the smaller ones like Telegram and Gab and things of that nature, where they don't have as much reach and as much influence. They've lost political leadership in the White House that was somewhat supportive of them and their movements. So I think the conditions that allowed for January 6th were pretty unique, and we're starting to kind of reverse back to what I would call regression to the mean. And the mean was always a present and significant threat, but one that was fairly manageable. Right? It was one where we had a small group of individuals that were radicalizing, that were participating in these online communities, that were actually willing to mobilize on behalf of them to do something criminal or dangerous. And that's kind of the norm in this field. Is extremism has what we call a low base rate of offending. Is the average person that adopts an extremist ideology won't actually act on behalf of it. It's a fringe, tiny portion of those individuals that will. So what will happen in the future, in my opinion, is you will absolutely see another mass casualty event in this country where we investigate the background of the individual and find out that they were active on these forums and these social media platforms. There will be more plots that will be uncovered, and people will be arrested for planning things. But a mass mobilization moment like we saw on January 6th, I think is unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do hope so. But now getting back to, the president has obviously the ear of the nation, and he has the bully pulpit. Do you feel that in and of itself can radicalize these people, or do you think it's that combined with other triggers that really makes them move?
I think it's one piece of the puzzle. I don't think it's the only piece. It's a really powerful one, though. I mean, this is an individual that has a tremendous amount of influence over the population. And so when they adopt an extremist viewpoint or leanings that way, or they push false narratives around election fraud or things of that nature, it's going to resonate with a large number of individuals. But when we're talking about mobilizing people, then actually getting them to take to the streets and to do something criminal or violent, that's when we have to look at the backgrounds of those individuals and figure out who's vulnerable to that type of narrative. Because we know that, most people that believe that that the election was stolen from Donald Trump didn't show up at the Capitol on January 6th and didn't engage in violence. It was some segment of that population that did. And so the question becomes, why was it those people?
It's bewildering why such a lie would even have legs. Why would such a lie that the election was stolen even have such movement when 60 plus courts ruled against it, where everyone else in the intelligence community said there was no fraud widespread. I don't understand what is so lacking in the psyche of these folks that they're willing to grasp at something. I mean, Donald Trump, he was not their savior. They, for some reason, they thought he was.
Yeah. Well,
I just don't understand.
part of it is a product of, 4 years of an administration that kept pushing the narrative of fake news, that you can't trust the voices that we've all come to trust and rely on. You can't trust the news media. You can't trust scientists. You can't trust academics. They're all against you and they're all against us. And everything they say is just a witch hunt. It's just a way of getting us and keeping us down. And that over 4 years of hearing that over and over and over again really sank in with some people. So they don't care that the courts are ruling over and over that there was no election fraud. They don't care that the FBI has come out and said that they can't find any evidence of wrongdoing around the election because they've been told for the last 4.5 years not to trust those individuals.
Donald Trump, before he became president, had a history of not paying contractors, had a history of not being trustworthy, had lied on a number of things, but these people still believed him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something I don't understand, but there were plenty of people that were willing to look past his past and personal failings, because he represented something that was really appealing to them, right? He was taking the fight to Washington on behalf of them, at least in their view. That's
In
what.
their view, right, right.
And so they were willing to look past an awful lot of bad things in his past and a lot of just in terms of his just personality that are not terribly appealing because of the fight that he was leading on their behalf.
Just before we close, I just wanted to touch on the left. Some will say the left, it's always, they don't get the attention that they should, that, when they were ruining property out on the West Coast in Oregon, they weren't getting the attention, the federal courthouses. What do you say to that?
Well, I say to that we do know that there have been individuals on the left that have engaged in criminal acts on behalf of their ideology. So in the 1970s, there was fairly large political movements like the Weather Underground in the United States that were involved in acts of terrorism on behalf of social justice goals. And in the 1980s and 90s, we saw environmental groups and animal rights organizations that engaged in criminal behavior, pushing an agenda. But what our data shows, and really what all data show, is that they just don't compare to the size of the movement on the far right. So, we find, there's on average about 60 terrorist attacks that occur in the United States every year, and the vast majority of them are committed by somebody with some type of far right extremist leaning, whether that be white supremacy or anti-government, sovereign citizens, militia members, things of that nature. And we have maybe a few individuals on the left that do something similar. And so the numbers just don't support the narrative that they're equal in terms of their size and in terms of their level of funding. And that's really just true of not just the data we've collected, but really the data everyone has collected.
Anything else you'd like to add before we close?
So, I think that, the next year or so is going to be really interesting with the Biden administration. They have a number of challenges ahead of them. They have to reverse some of things that the past administration did. So the past administration really restricted funding for research in this field, restricted what law enforcement was doing in this area. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to restore some of the initiatives that were in place before the Trump administration that were showing promise. Another thing is that they're going to have to tackle some really difficult legal questions about what they can do in this area as they shift their focus from international terrorism to domestic terrorism. A lot of the tools that are used by intelligence, by law enforcement, by prosecutors to counter international terrorism cannot be used in a domestic setting. And so we're going to have lots of questions over the coming months and years about how we disrupt financing of domestic terrorism. Are there new charges that we should be bringing against individuals that engage in these events? And there's just not a lot of power right now that law enforcement agencies and prosecutors have to deal with these cases. So I think that's going to be a big topic of discussion in the coming months.
I agree. They're going to be working on a domestic terrorism statute as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here. This has been quite enjoyable and informative, and thank you for the work that you do.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Jensen, for sharing his research and opinions on domestic terrorism and radicalization in the U.S. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guest, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. And remember, this information is for general educational purposes. It is not legal or professional advice. And now you can download our podcasts and subscribe online. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter.